Hello again. This video reviews the introductory lecture for Unit number 4, the 17th and 18th centuries. It's a bridge to the modern age and also to that well-known shift in the world's paradigm known as the Industrial Revolution. Let's take a look at some of the screens as we go through the introductory lecture together. Here is the screen that we had at the end of our last unit, the Elizabethan Renaissance. We remember that James was a cousin of Queen Elizabeth, both descended from Henry VII, and therefore, since he was already King of Scotland and her cousin and a Protestant, Parliament chose him to be Queen Elizabeth's successor. We have some of our early European American history coming in here. We had this as a screen at the end of our last presentation as well. We remember Jamestown, Virginia had been founded in 1607, the King James or Authorized Version in 1611, Plymouth Colony 1620, and then King James died in 1625. So when James died in 1625, his son Charles I ruled. But Charles dismissed Parliament. He believed in the divine right of kings like his father, and thought he could rule without a parliament. But anytime he needed money, he had to call Parliament back, and Parliament got tired of that. So the Parliament that reconvened was called the Long Parliament, and they passed a law stating the king could not dissolve Parliament anymore. So parliamentary leaders began the Great Rebellion and arrested Charles and eventually executed him. Oliver Cromwell took over as the new Lord Protector. So Parliament was split during this time between the traditional Anglicans, or the Episcopal group, and the ones who wanted to reform the Anglican Church and make it even less Catholic than it already was, and they were known as Puritans. The Catholics the Episcopals rather favored a traditional Catholic-style worship service. They had the mechanical instrument of music in worship. They saw their monarch as the head of the church, since they did not acknowledge the Pope in Rome, as the Catholics did, as the head of the church. And they still had the traditional Catholic-style hierarchy of bishops and archbishops. But the Puritans wanted a simpler worship style. Now, you have to remember, in this country, religion and politics were hand in hand. They were together. They weren't separate. And so the Puritans also wanted a simpler music form, going back to the New Testament, to have simple vocal music only, a cappella music we call it. They saw Christ as the head of the church, but did not want a temporal head of the church. They saw each congregation as independent, working together but still an independent congregational system, appointing its own preachers and church leaders. So these two groups still varied quite a bit. A Puritan leader, though, won. His name was Oliver Cromwell. He became a dictator, however. His army, known by people as Ironsides, but officially as the New Model Army, was very worldly, and there were a lot of abuses. The Puritans closed sporting events and the theater. They did not like people gathering in groups. They were afraid of sedition. And the people grew very, very tired of all of this. And so they demanded in 1660 that the royal family be invited back. They got rid of the Cromwells, and the royal son, Charles II, returned to England from France in what they call the restoration of the monarchy. Sports and theater became legal again. Women appeared on stage for the first time as actresses. But immediately, it seems, after they invited the royals back, there was disaster in the country. The Puritans, who were still around, said, well, that's it. God's punishing you for getting royals back in charge. But in 1663, 64, and the major outbreak in 65, there was a great outbreak of the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. And then in 1666, there was the Great Fire of London. Started in the King's Baker's house on Pudding Lane, probably an ember fire. It was dry. It hadn't rained in a long time. It was extremely windy, and the fire just got away from them. And 3/4 of London burned from this fire. After the fire, Sir Christopher Wren made plans to rebuild London. This time, the wood buildings gave way to stone and brick buildings. The thatched roofs gave way to tile roofs. Putting straw down in the streets every day gave way to more gravel being introduced into the road system. And so a lot of the roads were redone, were expanded, were widened, And many buildings still in London today are from this time period when Christopher Wren helped to rebuild London. Science and the arts begin to flourish, and Sir Isaac Newton formulates his laws of the universe. Well, Charles II had no heirs, and so his brother James, who was openly Catholic, took over in 1685. But the Protestant Parliament was going to allow him to rule, since he only had Protestant daughters. But when he had a son, and declared that the son would be raised Catholic, Parliament dismissed James, and he fled to France. But they invited his Protestant daughter Mary to rule with her Dutch husband, William of Orange. They had to sign a Bill of Rights first, though, stating that no Catholic could ever rule England again, and that Parliament had all true power. The country, though, was still in very horrible condition. There was no sanitation system, no police or fire departments. But there was one civilized place, the coffee house, where men of different classes could talk to one another. And in these coffee houses, they set up an early type of stock exchange so that the businesses could buy each other's shares of their companies. They started allowing people to vote on small referendums, and they put ballot boxes in these coffee houses. So the coffee house was a true meeting place where people of different social classes could get together and actually communicate for the first time in British history. Well, after William and Mary died first, and William ruled for a number of years after that. That's very unusual, because usually when a woman is queen in her own right, her husband is simply called a prince as an honorary title. But they did make an exception, since William was descended from British kings, and they named them a co-rulership. They had William as a true king and Mary as a true queen. But Mary died first. William continued to rule a few years after she died, and when he died, Mary's sister, Queen Anne, took over. Queen Anne's England saw many changes. England started the War of the Spanish Succession to break up a unified military force between Spain and France. John Churchill was the hero of that war, an ancestor of a more famous Churchill even, Winston Churchill in World War II. In 1707, England and Scotland officially united as the new Kingdom of Great Britain, with one parliament for both territories. Almost 300 years later, in 1997, Scotland finally got permission to reconvene its own parliament. England began to grow rich from imports and exports. Textiles were chief products, but iron and coal production was very popular. There was a growing middle class that made very fine homes in the cities. And this age has many nicknames: Age of Elegance, Age of Reason, the Neoclassical Age. Newspapers were printed, and satire became a chief literary form, especially led by Jonathan Swift's novel Gulliver's Travels. So this is really the birth time of the English novel as well. Eventually, Queen Anne died. She had many children, but none of them survived her. And the throne passed to a group of German cousins, the first of whom didn't even speak English at all. And they're known as the Hanoverians, or the Hanover family. George I, who did not speak English, took a quite minor interest in running the country. So Parliament got very strong, with ruling ministers taking charge. His son, George II, spoke more English, but allowed Parliament to appoint a prime minister to run things. And of course, that is still their current system. George II's grandson became the next king because his son had died early. And this grandson was the one that we know so well in our country, and that's George III, the king we fought against to get away from England in the American Revolutionary War. He taxed the American colonies too heavily, thus creating the American Revolution. If there's one movement that this time period, though, is certainly known for, it is what we can call an English baby. Just as the Renaissance was an Italian baby, and they can claim it, the British truly can claim the Industrial Revolution. Industry was accelerated by many inventions that increased production, especially in the textile industry. The Luddites, though, were a group that despised this new technology because machines were taking people's jobs. And they tried to break into factories and wreck machines to protest. Sometimes the word Luddite is still used for people who do not like technology. Corporate farms, though, were increasing, and the peasants began to move to the cities. And, of course, the city population started to boom. Roads and canals were built at this time. Medical knowledge was greatly increasing. Now, this may be called the Age of Elegance, but it was not elegant for everyone. There was a lot of abuse of women and children, workers, during this time. As a matter of fact, children could even be bought and sold legally as indentured servants during this time. But one philosophical movement began. It was called deism. Deism was a concept that a creator had made the world but really took no part in its operation. Deists did not believe in what we call a personal God. But they began civic groups to try to improve conditions in the country. Many early American founding fathers, including Jefferson, were deists. So they really didn't believe in the Bible. They believed Jesus was a wise Jewish teacher from the first century, but they did not believe in the divinity of Scripture. And since they thought that God would not solve the problems on this world, it was up to us. And so they began many charitable groups. Well, the churches realized they might start losing members to these deist groups. And so churches started jumping on the bandwagon as well, and they started benevolence programs and food programs, clothing programs. So people were being benefited, whether it was from the churches or from the deist movement. And of course, we have to add one more important thing that happened during this time. The United States became a country.